This government isn't being bought. It's selling off lives line by line, and you're the one cashing in." The words hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, delivered with surgical precision by Representative Jasmine Crockett as she stares down Senator Josh Hawley across a Senate chamber that has fallen into cathedral silence. The confrontation erupted during a Budget Committee hearing where Hawley had just presented his American Families Budget, a legislative masterpiece that slashed $95 billion from Medicaid while preserving $37 billion in tax breaks for pharmaceutical giants and energy corporations. What should have been routine political theater transformed into something far more dangerous, a moral reckoning with the machinery of sanctioned death that operates under the sterile language of fiscal responsibility. Crockett, armed with case files of the deceased and a whiteboard marker, had methodically dismantled the comfortable fiction that budgets are about numbers rather than lives. Because when the government reduces human lives to line items, and those line items get erased for corporate profit margins, the question isn't whether this could happen to someone you know, it's whether it already has. The fluorescent lights of Senate Committee Room 216 cast harsh shadows across mahogany tables, polished to mirror perfection. Senator Josh Hawley rose before the Budget Committee with the practiced confidence of a man who had delivered variations of this presentation in a dozen different rooms across Washington. His voice carried the righteous certainty of someone who believed his own press releases, each word calibrated for maximum political impact. Behind him, the slideshow clicked to life with graphics designed by communications specialists who understood that perception shapes reality more effectively than truth. The first slide bore the title, "A Budget for Real American Families," in patriotic red, white, and blue. Hawley gestured toward it with the confidence of a preacher citing scripture, his rhetoric flowing with the smooth cadence of rehearsed conviction. He outlined his vision with increasing animation, $95 billion in Medicaid reductions, offset by $37 billion in what he termed targeted tax relief for pillar industries. His finger traced across the screen to highlight key figures, each number representing what he characterized as smart cuts and strategic investments. The pie chart that appeared next would later become infamous in political circles. A massive wedge labeled tax incentives for growth sectors dominated nearly 2/3 of the visual, while a sliver marked federal health care programs occupied what looked like an afterthought. Conservative media representatives in the gallery began typing furiously on their phones. Within minutes, Twitter would be flooded with praise for what they called bold fiscal leadership and common-sense approaches to government spending. The narrative was already being written before the hearing had even concluded. But in the third row, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat with unusual stillness, her dark eyes fixed not on Hawley, but on the numbers floating behind him. She had requested to observe this hearing specifically, though her presence raised eyebrows among the Senate staff. House members rarely attended Senate Budget Committee meetings unless they had particular business there. Crockett's business, as it would soon become clear, was not the kind that appeared on official agendas. Her legal training had taught her to listen for contradictions, to identify the moments when an opponent's argument contained the seeds of its own destruction. Hawley was providing her with abundant material, each euphemism and carefully modulated phrase adding another weapon to her growing arsenal. She used the time to study the faces around her, the pharmaceutical lobbyist in the front row, whose smile widened with each mention of targeted tax relief. The energy sector representatives taking notes on what appeared to be very expensive stationery. The expressions of reporters who seemed more interested in capturing quotable sound bites than examining the human cost of the numbers being discussed. Most importantly, she studied Hawley himself. The way his shoulders straightened when he spoke about American families, the practiced humility in his voice when he described difficult but necessary decisions. The genuine conviction in his eyes when he spoke about protecting traditional values and the dignity of work. This wasn't cynical political manipulation. He genuinely believed his own rhetoric. This made him more dangerous than a typical political operative, but it also made him more vulnerable. The final slide of his presentation featured a montage of American imagery, farmers at work, factory employees, suburban families gathered around dinner tables. The implicit message was clear: this budget protected these people, these values, this way of life. The text overlay read simply, "Protecting what matters most." As Hawley concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, the room buzzing with the subdued energy that follows major policy presentations, Crockett reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. Inside were 3 case files, each containing medical records, death certificates, and family photographs. She had spent the previous week collecting these stories from her district and beyond, knowing that eventually she would need them. The moment had arrived sooner than expected. When the hearing resumed after a brief recess, Crockett had positioned herself at the observers' table in a way that commanded sight lines to both the committee members and the gallery, her manila folder, now open, its contents arranged with the precision of a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. Committee Chair Senator Susan Collins recognized Crockett for questions and commentary, though this was somewhat irregular. House members typically didn't have speaking privileges in Senate committee hearings, but Crockett had invoked a rarely used provision, allowing for expert testimony on matters of urgent national concern. Crockett rose slowly, her movement commanding attention in a way that theatrical gestures never could. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the performative anger common to political confrontations. Instead, it held the steady cadence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms where truth mattered more than applause. She thanked Hawley for his presentation, noting particularly his repeated emphasis on American families, 14 references by her count, which suggested this was central to his vision. She expressed her desire to test that vision against some specific cases, her tone suggesting this was heading toward something more substantive than routine political sparring. Hawley shifted slightly in his seat, unsure of the direction this examination was taking. His chief of staff, seated behind him, leaned forward with the alert posture of someone sensing potential danger. Crockett's first question cut through the political rhetoric like a blade through silk. She asked whether this was a budget or a bureaucratic execution, the question delivered with such matter-of-fact precision that its inflammatory nature almost didn't register immediately. She explained that she had 3 case files that suggested the distinction might be academic. She lifted the first folder and began describing Marcus Thompson, age 8, from East St. Louis. The boy had suffered from severe asthma, managed successfully with Medicaid-funded treatments for 3 years. Changes to federal Medicaid matching funds had reduced his family's coverage. Marcus had suffered an attack on a Tuesday. His mother called 911, but the ambulance took him to a hospital that no longer accepted their insurance. By the time they reached a facility that would treat him, Marcus was in respiratory failure. The room had grown very quiet as she described how Marcus died Thursday morning. The total cost of the treatment that might have saved him was approximately $38,000. She placed a photograph on the table, a school picture of a smiling boy with gap teeth and bright eyes, and observed that his family would be interested to know how their loss contributed to American renewal. Hawley's jaw tightened as he attempted to maintain composure. This was clearly a prepared attack designed to personalize what should remain a policy discussion. He responded that while he sympathized with any family's loss, budget, decisions couldn't be made based on individual anecdotes. They had to look at the broader fiscal picture. Crockett repeated his phrase about the broader fiscal picture and produced a second document. She held up what appeared to be a corporate expense report from Pharmatech Industries, one of the companies benefiting from the proposed tax credits. Their CEO, Michael Brennan, had received a performance bonus last quarter worth $12.7 million, justified as compensation for profit optimization through strategic cost management. She let that information settle in the air before noting that Brennan's bonus alone could have funded Marcus Thompson's treatment 334 times over. She supposed this was just coincidence. Several committee members were now taking notes with increasing urgency, their pens moving with the recognition that they were witnessing something significant. The pharmaceutical lobbyist in the front row was no longer smiling. Crockett activated the room's presentation system, displaying a split-screen image on the left, a line item showing $38,000 emergency asthma treatment denied, and on the right, $38,000 first-class travel CEO retreat, Swiss Alps. She observed that these numbers weren't theoretical. They represented choices about who lives and who dies, made by people who would never face the consequences of those decisions. Hawley attempted to regain control by creating what he characterized as false equivalencies. He argued that the tax incentives would generate jobs and economic growth benefiting everyone, including working families. Crockett interrupted to ask about working families like the Johnsons. She produced a second photograph of Maria Johnson, a single mother who worked 2 jobs in Kansas City. Her daughter Sophia had type 1 diabetes. Under the proposed Medicaid cuts, Sophia's insulin coverage would be reduced by 60%. Maria would have to choose between keeping the lights on and keeping her daughter alive. The next slide showed a medical chart with 2 columns: Sophia's monthly insulin cost $1,200 and Pharmatech CEO's daily salary $34,500. Crockett described how Maria worked 70 hours a week between jobs at Target, and McDonald's paid taxes, followed the law, and apparently didn't qualify as a real American family deserving of protection. Meanwhile, Brennan, who made more money during this hearing than Maria made in a year, somehow represented the American values Hawley was defending. The mathematical precision of the comparison was devastating. Numbers, as Crockett well knew, didn't lie, but they could be made to reveal truths that comfortable political rhetoric preferred to keep hidden. She advanced to her final slide, a flowchart that traced the movement of money with surgical precision. Medicaid cuts, federal surplus, tax credits, executive compensation. Red arrows connected each step, creating a visual map of how suffering transformed into profit. This was Hawley's budget. She explained not an abstraction or policy paper, but a mechanism that took money from dying children and gave it to millionaire executives. And he was asking them to applaud this as moral leadership. The silence in the room had become oppressive. Even Hawley's usual allies seemed uncomfortable, their eyes focused on their notes, rather than meeting anyone's gaze. The journalists were typing frantically, recognizing that whatever they had expected from this hearing, they were witnessing something entirely different. Hawley's response carried the defensive edge of a man who recognized he was losing control of the narrative. His media training had prepared him for standard political attacks, but Crockett's approach, methodical, fact-based, and ruthlessly personal, fell outside the usual playbook. He attempted to reassert authority through posture, while explaining that Crockett was fundamentally misunderstanding their objectives. He spoke about protecting traditional values, families that work hard, follow the law, and contribute to their communities. He emphasized personal responsibility and the dignity of work over government dependency that trapped people in cycles of poverty. It was exactly the response Crockett had been hoping for. Hawley had just provided her with the perfect setup for what would become the hearing's defining moment. She repeated his phrase about traditional values and pulled out 3 photographs, placing them side by side on the table, where the cameras could capture them clearly. She expressed her desire to explore what that meant in practice, presenting 3 American families for evaluation. The first photograph showed a well-dressed man in his 50s, standing with his wife and 2 teenage children in front of what appeared to be a lakeside vacation home. She introduced Robert Brennan, the same CEO mentioned earlier. His family owned 3 homes, sent their children to private schools, and took annual vacations to Europe. Brennan's total compensation last year was $47 million, much of it taxed at capital gains rates, thanks to loopholes that Hawley's budget preserved and expanded. The second photograph showed a black family of 4, standing in front of a modest apartment building. She described the Williams family from St. Louis. Jerome worked at a Ford plant 47 hours a week. His wife Denise cleaned offices downtown. They had 2 children, honor roll students who dreamed of college. They paid taxes, volunteered at their church, and had never been arrested. Under the Medicaid cuts, they would lose coverage for their son's epilepsy medication. The third photograph was the most devastating: a young Latina woman holding a toddler, both standing in what appeared to be a hospital corridor. This was Carmen Rodriguez, 22 years old, who worked at a nursing home caring for elderly patients while studying for her LPN certification at night and raising her daughter alone. Carmen's mother had died last year when Medicaid funding cuts meant she couldn't afford her heart medication. Crockett let the images speak for themselves before asking the question that would be replayed on news programs for weeks afterward: which of these families fit his definition of traditional values and which ones deserved protection. Hawley's discomfort was now visible to everyone in the room. The question was clearly a trap, and they all recognized it. Any answer he gave would either contradict his stated principles or reveal their true nature. He responded carefully that all American families deserved protection, but distinctions had to be made between helping people become self-sufficient and creating co-permanent dependency on government assistance. Crockett repeated the word dependency and asked whether Brennan's company receiving $3.2 billion in tax credits represented incentivizing innovation, while Carmen Rodriguez needing help affording her mother's heart medication represented dependency. She activated the presentation system again, displaying a split screen that would become iconic in political media coverage. On the left, footage from a recent pharmaceutical industry, gala executives in tuxedos raising champagne glasses in a ballroom that probably cost more to rent than most families earned in a year. On the right, security camera footage from a hospital emergency room showing patients in wheelchairs waiting in overcrowded hallways. As the footage played, she narrated what budget protection looked like in practice. The left screen showed Pharmatech's annual celebration of record profits. The right screen showed the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital in East St. Louis, where patients waited an average of 8 hours because Medicaid cuts had forced the hospital to reduce staff. The juxtaposition was visceral and undeniable. The champagne glasses caught light from crystal chandeliers, while patients slumped in wheelchairs under harsh fluorescent lighting. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was designed to be brutal. Her conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. Hawley's budget didn't protect families, it protected privilege and strangled everyone else. She clicked to the next slide, showing 2 arrows. The first pointed from Medicaid cuts $95 billion to increased federal revenue. The second pointed from tax credits $37 billion to Pharmatech profits plus $12 billion. This wasn't complicated economics, she observed. It was arithmetic. Taking $95 billion from sick children and giving $37 billion to profitable corporations. The math was simple. The morality was appalling. Hawley made one final attempt to regain the moral high ground, suggesting that Crockett came from a district where government dependency was high, but national policy couldn't be based on the assumption that private sector success was somehow immoral. These companies provided jobs, developed life-saving medications, and drove innovation benefiting everyone. It was the wrong thing to say, and everyone in the room recognized it the moment the words left his mouth. Crockett's eyes flashed with something that made several observers lean forward in their seats. She repeated his phrase about government dependency with quiet intensity. She represented people who worked multiple jobs and still couldn't afford insulin, while he represented donors who made millions as those same people died. If they were discussing dependency, she suggested they be honest about who depended on whom. She gathered the 3 family photographs and held them up one more time. Jerome Williams depended on Medicaid to prevent his son from having seizures. Carmen Rodriguez had depended on it to keep her mother alive. Robert Brennan depended on tax loopholes to avoid paying his fair share. The difference, she concluded, was that Jerome and Carmen actually needed help. Brennan just wanted more money. The room fell into this kind of silence that follows a knockout punch. Even Hawley's staff had stopped taking notes. What happened next would be dissected by political analysts for months afterward, but those present in the room understood immediately that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Crockett had not simply challenged Hawley's budget proposal, she had performed a moral autopsy on it, and the results were devastating. She asked permission to use the presentation equipment, her tone suddenly conversational, almost casual. The shift was so unexpected that Hawley nodded before considering whether it was wise to do so. Crockett walked to the whiteboard beside the committee table, normally used for technical presentations. She picked up a black marker and began drawing what appeared to be a flowchart, her movements deliberate, each line drawn with the precision of someone who had thought through this presentation many times. She explained that she wanted to show how his budget actually worked, writing "Medicaid cuts 95 balanço" in a box at the top left of the board. This money didn't disappear, she noted it went somewhere. She drew an arrow pointing to a second box labeled Federal Surplus. Then another arrow to a third box reading Tax Credits for Big Pharma, 37 bars. A final arrow pointed to the last box, Executive Bonuses. She described this as the budget in its simplest form, money flowing from sick children to wealthy executives. This wasn't political rhetoric, she emphasized. It was mathematical fact. She wrote beneath the diagram, "Cost of care denied, Owl's profit approved." The visual was stark, undeniable, and would be photographed hundreds of times in the following hours as images from the hearing circulated across social media. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pulled out a folded newspaper from the previous day's Kansas City Star. The headline read, "9-year-old dies after Medicaid coverage expires. Pharmatech stock hits record high." She held up the newspaper so the cameras could capture both the headline and her face, while describing David Chen, who had leukemia. His family's Medicaid coverage was reduced under preliminary budget cuts implemented last quarter. They couldn't afford his chemotherapy. David died Tuesday. On the same day David Chen died, she continued reading Pharmatech, announced quarterly profits of $2.8 billion, up 23% from last year. CEO Robert Brennan credited strategic cost management for the improved performance. She placed the newspaper on the table and returned to the whiteboard, writing, "Strategic cost management," beneath her diagram. That's what they called it when children died for their profit margins. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. From the gallery, a woman in scrubs stood up. She was clearly not part of the planned proceedings, and security began moving toward her, but Crockett held up a hand to stop them. The woman identified herself as Jennifer Martinez, a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital who wanted to say something. Senator Collins looked uncertain about allowing this breach of protocol, but the room's attention was completely focused on the nurse making any attempt to remove her potentially explosive. Martinez revealed that she had been David Chen's nurse, that she had held his hand when he died. His mother kept apologizing to her, apologizing for not being able to afford the treatment that could have saved him. She thought it was her fault. Her voice broke slightly as she continued describing how she witnessed this every week now, parents choosing between rent and medication rationing insulin, bringing their children to the emergency room only when they were dying because they couldn't afford preventive care. She looked directly at Hawley and explained that these weren't statistics, they were children with names, faces, dreams. And they were dying because of choices made in rooms like this by people who would never face the consequences. Security remained uncertain how to handle this situation. The nurse wasn't being disruptive in any threatening way, but she was definitely violating hearing protocols. More importantly, her words were being broadcast live on C-SPAN and recorded by every news outlet present. Crockett seized the moment, thanking Martinez for her service and for speaking truth to power. Her voice represented thousands of healthcare workers who witnessed the human cost of these budget decisions every single day. She turned back to Hawley, noting that he had heard from a nurse who watched children die because of budget cuts, seen the mathematical flow of money from those children to pharmaceutical executives, and been presented with specific names, faces, and stories of the families affected by his policies. She picked up the marker and drew one final element on her diagram, a red line connecting Medicaid cuts directly to CEO bonus, bypassing all the intermediate steps. "This isn't a budget," she declared. "It's a death map." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Several committee members were visibly uncomfortable, their eyes darting between Hawley and the television cameras, capturing every moment of this confrontation. Hawley finally found his voice, rejecting her characterization completely. He insisted the budget was about fiscal responsibility and economic growth that would benefit all Americans in the long term. Crockett interrupted to ask about all Americans, listing David Chen, Marcus Thompson, and Carmen Rodriguez's mother, all Americans who were now dead. She asked how exactly his fiscal responsibility had benefited them. She walked over to the newspaper and held it up again, describing this as his legacy. Every line item in his budget had a human cost. Every tax break for pharmaceutical companies was paid for with the lives of children who couldn't afford the medications those companies produced. When he wanted to talk about fiscal responsibility, she suggested he take responsibility for this. She placed the newspaper directly in front of Hawley, the photograph of young David Chen staring up at him from the front page. The room fell into complete silence. Even the usual background noise of air conditioning and shuffling papers seemed to have stopped. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented in American political discourse, a complete moral evisceration of a policy position delivered with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. The final act began not with words, but with silence. Crockett stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, surrounded by the visual evidence of what she had just demonstrated. The flowchart behind her told a story that no amount of political rhetoric could obscure money flowing from dying children to wealthy executives, with the United States Senate serving as the mechanism of transfer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the anger or passion that had marked her earlier statements. Instead, it held the quiet certainty of someone delivering a verdict. She noted that Hawley had asked them to consider what kind of America they wanted to build, speaking about protecting families, preserving values, and ensuring fiscal responsibility. She believed they had established exactly what those words meant in practice. She walked to her table and picked up the 3 family photographs she had displayed earlier, describing how they represented Hawley's America made manifest. The Brennan family, wealthy, protected beneficiaries of his tax policies. The Williams family working, struggling, targeted by his cuts. The Rodriguez family devastated, destroyed, sacrificed for his fiscal discipline. She arranged the photographs in a line on the committee table, each one facing the cameras, and characterized this as his America, his moral vision in action. Some families mattered, others didn't. Some lives had value, others were acceptable losses. Hawley shifted uncomfortably, unable to find an effective response. His media training had prepared him for standard political attacks, but Crockett's approach transcended conventional political discourse. She was operating on a different level entirely, one where policy positions were judged not by their electoral viability, but by their human consequences. She observed what was most remarkable about this hearing wasn't that his budget prioritized corporate profits over human lives. They had seen that before. It wasn't even that he was asking them to applaud this prioritization, as moral leadership politicians had been doing that for decades. She picked up the newspaper with David Chen's photograph and held it so everyone could see it clearly. What was remarkable, she said, was that he genuinely seemed to believe his own rhetoric. He actually thought that letting children die to increase pharmaceutical profits represented traditional American values. The accusation was delivered with such matter-of-fact precision that its devastating nature almost didn't register immediately. Several committee members looked genuinely shocked, not just at what Crockett was saying, but at the clinical way she was saying it. She announced her intention to be very clear about what they had established, returning to the whiteboard one final time. She drew a large rectangle and labeled it the American Budget. Inside the rectangle, she drew two columns, Who Lives and Who Dies. Under Who Lives, she wrote, Pharmaceutical CEOs, energy executives, anyone with enough money for private health care. Under Who Dies, she wrote, Children without insurance, families rationing medication, anyone dependent on Medicaid. This was his budget, she explained, not a policy document, but a sentencing matrix. He wasn't allocating resources. He was allocating life and death, and he was doing it with the precision of someone who had never had to face the consequences of those decisions. She stepped back from the whiteboard and faced Hawley, directly asking one final question when David Chen's mother held her dying son, and wondered why America had abandoned them. What exactly would he have told her about traditional values and fiscal responsibility? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Everyone in the room understood that any answer Hawley gave would be inadequate, but his silence was equally damaging. He was trapped in a moment of his own making, forced to confront the human reality of his political abstractions. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the confident authority he had displayed earlier. He expressed understanding that these were difficult situations, that no one wanted to see children suffer, but they had to make hard choices about resource allocation. Crockett cut through his explanation like a blade repeating his phrase about hard choices. She described him sitting in a room that cost more to renovate than most people made in a lifetime, wearing a suit that cost more than many families spent on groceries in a month, defending policies that would generate millions in profits for his donors. There was nothing hard about his choices, she concluded. They were just evil. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, in the carefully modulated language of American politics, where even the most extreme positions were typically described in euphemistic terms. The direct moral judgment was shocking. She delivered her final statement with rising intensity. This government isn't being bought. It's selling off lives line by line, and you're the one cashing in. She closed her laptop with a decisive snap and began gathering her materials. The symbolic finality of the gesture was unmistakable. She was done presenting evidence, done making arguments, done treating this as a policy debate between reasonable people with different priorities. She announced she had nothing more to say to Hawley, but had something to say to everyone watching. Looking directly into the cameras with steady, unwavering gaze, she noted that this had passed committee. But David Chen hadn't passed his 9th birthday. Marcus Thompson hadn't passed 2nd grade, and Carmen Rodriguez's mother hadn't passed her 50th birthday. She picked up the whiteboard eraser and began wiping away everything except the final line she had written, "The American budget equals who lives, who dies." She gestured toward the remaining text and described this as what American democracy looked like in 2025. A system where children died so that millionaires could become billionaires, administered by people who had convinced themselves that this represented moral leadership. She turned back to Hawley one final time with her conclusion, "The budget isn't wrong, Senator. It's precise, precisely horrifying." With that, she gathered her remaining materials and walked toward the exit. The room remained in complete silence as she moved, her footsteps echoing in the marble corridors of power where life and death decisions were made with the casual efficiency of corporate accounting. Behind her, she left a whiteboard with a single line of text that would be photographed, shared, and remembered long after the details of the budget proposal had been forgotten. The American budget equals who lives, who dies. 6 months after the hearing, the effects of Hawley's budget had rippled through the American healthcare system with mathematical precision. The Congressional Budget Office released a report estimating that Medicaid cuts would result in 847 preventable deaths in the first year alone, while pharmaceutical companies reported record quarterly profits exceeding $34 billion. Crockett's performance that day had made her a national figure, invited to speak at universities and policy conferences across the country. But she rarely discussed the hearing itself. Instead, she carried different documentation, now thank you letters, from families whose children had survived because her confrontation with Hawley had generated enough political pressure to delay some of the most severe cuts. The letters were handwritten, often on notebook paper, signed by parents who wanted her to know that her willingness to speak truth to power had literally saved their children's lives. She kept them in the same manila folder that had once held David Chen's medical records. In his office in Missouri, Senator Hawley continued defending the budget as necessary fiscal medicine, pointing to rising pharmaceutical stock prices as evidence of its success. He had successfully won re-election the following November, supported by record campaign contributions from healthcare industry PACs, who appreciated his business-friendly approach to government spending. Pharmatech CEO Robert Brennan had used his increased profits to purchase a 4th vacation home, this one in the Swiss Alps, where his company maintained its tax-sheltered research division. In interviews, he frequently praised the pro-growth policies that had made such investments possible. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital in East St. Louis had closed entirely, unable to sustain operations after Medicaid funding cuts made treating low-income patients financially impossible. The building now housed a storage facility for medical equipment that was shipped to private hospitals in wealthier suburbs. Jennifer Martinez, the nurse, who had spoken from the gallery that day, had quit her job at Children's Hospital and now worked for a non-profit organization documenting the health impacts of budget cuts. Her reports, meticulously researched and deeply personal, were read by policymakers who praised her important work while continuing to vote for similar budget measures. The whiteboard from Committee Room 216 had been cleaned and used for hundreds of other presentations since that day in May. But sometimes late at night, when the building was empty except for security guards and cleaning staff, visitors claimed they could still see the faint outline of words that had been erased, but never really disappeared. The American budget equals who lives, who dies. The arithmetic remained unchanged. In a nation that spent more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, that gave tax breaks to profitable corporations, while children rationed insulin, the equation was simple and devastating. Some lives had value. Others were acceptable losses. And the difference was determined not by moral worth or human dignity, but by the contents of campaign contribution accounts and the quarterly reports of pharmaceutical companies. Crockett understood this arithmetic better than most. She had seen it written in death certificates and medical bills, in the eyes of parents who had to choose between medicine and rent. In the silence that followed her question to Senator Hawley about what he would tell a dying child's mother about traditional values. The budget had passed. The system had worked exactly as designed. And somewhere in America, another mother was holding another child's school picture, wondering how the richest nation in human history had decided that her family's survival was less important than a pharmaceutical executive's bonus. The arithmetic of power never changed. It only found new ways to hide its calculations behind the comfortable language of fiscal responsibility and traditional values administered by people who had learned to measure human worth in dollars and cents, and to sleep soundly in beds paid for with the profits of sanctioned suffering. This was American democracy in 2020, efficient, profitable, and precisely horrifying.